a series of unrelated murders. Chapter 1. It was the third month of the year. The heat waves had just begun to get warmer and warmer by the day. The hasty change in the temperatures could be felt by everyone, even those with dead skin which could not feel a thing. Anybody who woke to the scorching day wished they could just go back to sleep and wake up directly during the fall. The town of Homerville hadn't seen such a climate since beginning of World War II. As Mr. Lopez wiped the sweat that dripped from his forehead through his neck, he checked for the cash in his shirt pocket he had left from last night. He had a name tag on the pocket, which had the name, Edward Lopez, in white ink, embedded on it, with the words "the manager" written beneath it. He rummaged through his pocket, eagerly hoping his wife Diana hadn't taken any again, to buy nicotine gum. This often was the theme of their arguments, as Diana had never smoked a cigarette in her life. Well, at least that's what she had told him. Diana regularly went to the local store to buy the nicotine gum, which was 7 miles from the motel her husband owns. Correction. She owns. She had got it in her father's will, which her 2 brothers were resolute that their father would leave it to either one of them. Even Diana was sure she couldn't get a penny from her father, let alone the motel. She never had a close relation with her father, after he left their mother, while she was pregnant with Diana. But as it turned out, he loved Diana more than she had thought. He even left her his local store and his pickup truck, a black Chevrolet El Camino. It reminded her too much of her father, and the pain he caused her mother. Edward couldn't find a single penny in his pocket. He was furious at Diana. But he could do nothing, as she was at the store, that very minute. Her store was run by her childhood friend, Frank. As her husband was least bothered to look after her store, Diana wandered through the store, checking to verify if everything was in order at her store. She approached the counter, with the nicotine gum, and a bottle of water. "Hello, Diane," said Frank, who stood behind the counter, dressed in a dark blue apron, over his white shirt. "You know, I don't like Diane," she said. "Why don't you just call me Diana, like everyone else does?" she asked him. Frank was working at the store since the last 2 years. Diana had never brought a single commodity from her own store. Prior to Frank working here, Edward had always confronted Diana why she went to the same store, just to buy a pen, or a bottle of water, when they didn't even need it. Diana habitually deflected Edward's allegations by the point that Frank's store was the only one near their godforsaken motel. She'd change their argument's direction, hovering over Edward's decision to accept the motel from her father, or her mother-in-law's abusive behavior, and also reviving the reason why they got married in the first place. By the time by which Edward would have forgotten his issues with Diana and Frank. Both Diana and Frank stood in the aisle of the food section, looking over stuff Diana could cook for her husband. They wandered through different shelves looking for nothing. Frank and Diana just connected, which she never could with her husband, ever since summer of last year, after the incident. Diana knew Frank was attracted to her. The way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, the attention he gave her, all were dead giveaways. After the problems Edward and she had, she just needed someone to connect with, someone to just talk with. Diana knew she couldn't stay there any longer, not if she didn't want to give Edward another reason for a spat. Gathering all the stuff she never needed, putting it in her purse anyhow, and started walking towards her pickup. As she tuned the radio to her favorite station, stepped on the gas, feeding the engine, and left for the place she never wanted to be, home. Already feeling sickened by the thought of being in bed with her husband and his cruel nature, she drove in and parked her truck and headed straight to her room. She stayed with Edward in one of the 12 rooms in the motel. She walked through the front, past the reception which was well guarded by her husband. "Where have you been?" Edward inquired. "You know where I was. Then why do you need to ask?" she replied. "I had gone to check on the store. It's my responsibility after all." "Don't give me that responsibility crap. I know why you went there," he said with a raised voice. "You think I wouldn't know what is going on between my wife and that vulture? He has been waiting to get his hands on you. Can't you see that?" he asked. "Why can't you trust me? I am your wife," she said. "Trust you? I am not accusing. I am pretty sure you two have already done it," he said. "If you can't trust me, then why did you marry me?" Diana replied with disgust. "Why did I marry you?" he asked rhetorically. "I know you have been waiting to find excuses to make me leave you, so that you can keep this motel in the divorce. You won't wait for a minute to jump into a bed with Frank. Would you?" Edward said. "Oh, hell with you," she yelled. "Don't drop me down to your level. I know you bring whores in my motel whenever I go to visit my mom. You think I am stupid?" she screamed. "Who's the bitch right now in room 7? She clearly doesn't look like a customer to me. She has been living here for the last 4 weeks, without paying the rent. Oh wait, she surely might be paying you, by the night. Am I right, jackass? I don't say anything to you, so you get the courage to do whatever you like," she said. "Drop dead. I don't want to see your face. I am leaving," bellowed Diana. "Oh, I know where you are going," Edward said. "You are going to Frank, right? To fuck with him?" he asked. "I was going to my mom's, but, you know, now that you have mentioned it, I just might go fuck Frank. As it is, you think I already have." She always tried to bury her desires for Frank. But it was time. She couldn't let the feelings she had in her within any more. Diana wanted to just let go. She went and stood in front of the door of the store, pushed it open, looked at Frank. She didn't have the time, nor the courage or the mental strength to rationalize. A feeling of revenge was in her, against Edward. She knew if she weighed in right and wrong she would never do it. It was time to do something for herself, something irrespective of approved or acceptable. It was time to fulfill her selfish desires. She gave in to her animal craving and let loose of herself. She leapt in on Frank, threw her remains onto his body. She pulled his shirt as hard as she could, wrapped her arms around Frank. He pressed his body against hers, feeling every drop of satisfaction he had fantasized about. He ripped every strap of her clothes, after removing the only piece of clothing she was wearing. Diana let her hair loose as she removed the pencil from her hair which was holding it all this while. She had long brunette hair. As they both went in the storage unit of the store dressed only in her jeans and bare breast, she realized what she had done was wrong. But it was too late, she couldn't control her desires. She moaned in the background. Frank locked the doors and turned off the lights. The haste act of sin was done. Diana gathered her clothes, grasped the fact that what she had just done could in no way avenge for the infidelity of her husband. It could only gratify her for the time being. But it wasn't a solution to her problems. It might have only added to the complications if not reduced it. Diana knew she had to face the situation. Running from it was not a way out. She sat in her truck and headed home to finish things forever. She parked, entered her motel, with unexplainable drive in her. She turned to the reception counter, hoping to burst on Edward, but he was nowhere to be found. All her energy was lost in a second. Like a burst of a bubble. The strong determination she had, just vanished. She thought, maybe it was her fault that she spent too much time with Frank, and that made Edward jealous. Also the fact that Edward was jealous suggests that he still loves her, no matter where, or who else, Edward had been with. Her thoughts made her weak. She decided to give her marriage another try. Diana tried to go directly to her room to avoid her husband. She thought if Edward slept over the matter overnight he would forget about it. She couldn't go directly to her room, as she didn't have the key. Edward always made her keep the key at the counter, just in case an extra room was needed for the customers. On days when she didn't even get a room to sleep, Diana had to sleep in the storage room behind the kitchen. But she cherished such occasions, since Edward would always stay at the reception for his customers, and Diana would get to sleep unaccompanied. She took the key from the counter, rushed to her room, opened the door and jumped onto her bed. As if she could hide from what she had just done, she laid on her side of the bed. Diana found it difficult to fall asleep. She was preoccupied by the many questions that stood in her face. How would she confess to Edward what she had done? Or should she even confess in the first place? All were the doubts which kept her away from sleep. Finally worn out, thinking about her circumstances, she slid over the bed, opened Edward's drawer, removed 2 sleeping pills and forced it down, with a glass of water. The hours went by. The motel was distinguishably quiet. Not a single soul made a sound. Diana overslept, as she was not used to taking sleeping pills and it was her first time on the pills. Diana gradually gained her consciousness. She felt an arm around her waist. She felt comforted by the thought that Edward had seemed to have forgiven her, and was in bed with her. Diana's eyes were still half shut. She rolled and turned over, while tenderly patting the arm that was around her hip. She gradually opened her eyes, and saw it wasn't her husband's arm. It was another man, in her bed, with her. It was Sam, who worked in the cafeteria of her hotel. She was stunned to see him. He was lying naked in her bed. She could not understand a thing. She shoots up from her bed, still with a heavy head from the pills she had taken last night. She turned her head and noticed they were not alone in the room. There were 3 other people in the room, none of them seemed conscious. She recognized 2 of them. The 2 men were the guests who were staying in her motel. The third person was a lady lying near the foot of the bed. The woman's head was facing the floor, so Diana could not make out who she was. Diana's body froze. She was frightened. Then suddenly, she realized she was in a different room. It wasn't the same room she had slept in last night. She had no memory what had happened the night before. With trembling hands, she turned Sam over, only to find a pool of blood on the bedsheets under Sam's body. She screamed in horror and jumped out of the bed. She went for the door, but it was blocked by the body of the 2 men lying on the floor. She heard an echo outside the room. Petrified, she ran towards the restroom. Diana slammed the door open. What she saw there terrified her to her bones. It was her husband, Edward, lying there, next to the bathtub, bleeding. Diana rushed towards him. With twitching fingers, she checked his neck for a pulse. She was so afraid that she could not make out the difference between her shaky fingers and the sensation of Edward's pulse. It remained uncertain if Edward was dead or alive. End of chapter 1.